I don't see the next slide. Oh, there it is. Well, good. It's a little bit delay in the slides there, so you will see. Welcome, Matt Price. There's Matt on screen. Good to see you, man. And he is the head strength of the Los Angeles Kings Hockey Club in LA there. Matt is from Canada, born in Toronto, has spent 35 years in hockey. I know as a player, as an athlete, probably from a very early age, as you do in Canada. Been active in strength and conditioning in 20 years after his master's of kinesiology from the University of Calgary. Prior to hockey, Matt worked in alpine skiing with the Canadian alpine team, I think from Calgary. And as of the last 6 years, you've been the head strength coach for the Los Angeles Kings. So without further ado, help me give a good virtual hands together for Matt, and we'll hand over to him for his presentation. Welcome, Matt, and thank you for being here.
Great, thanks for having me, Peter. You know, great to have everyone here, and obviously probably the biggest kitchen party I've ever hosted. So, you know, a few hundred people in this small space is it's kind of fun. Just wanted to thank you guys for having me on. Obviously, we've had a long and strong relationship with the Kings and 1080 Motion from the early days, and it continues to grow and develop. Wanted to thank everyone else for taking the time today to join us. Like Peter said, it's crazy times, and safety and health is first and foremost with our family, friends, and loved ones. But certainly a unique time that presents an incredible opportunity to learn, grow, and explore new projects, new ideas, and new topics. And my hope today is that what I share can certainly move the needle in a positive direction for everyone participating, and that you learn something new. So today, what I wanted to talk about is how we've implemented and applied the 1080 Motion technology into our training environment, and particularly how we assess performance and how we monitor our athletes. So getting started, just a quick overview of what I'll touch on, and real simply, I'll give you a little background on the sport of hockey for those of you who aren't super familiar. I'll keep it brief, and a little bit of the background on why 1080 was important to what we do and how it got implemented into our gym, because it's not something that you go and pick off the shelf. So clearly there's a little bit of a background story there. Probably the meat and potatoes of everything will be how we apply the technology, and I think that's the real important parts. Of course, it's something new. It's something that most people still haven't quite wrapped their heads around. So I think that the lessons we've learned, it's certainly led us down some new paths, and I want to touch on some of the newfound insights, and I'll wrap up with future directions in the areas that we're most interested in now moving forward, and how we're hopefully going to tackle those new questions. So first and foremost, so working in the National Hockey League, we are North American based. You know, Canada and the U.S. we play 82 games. The games are played in approximately 180 days. So for all intents and purposes, we're playing every other day. And what that means is we're a games-based sport. So we don't have a lot of practice time. We don't have a lot of opportunity for training. And those small windows of opportunity are very, very precious. So just to put some context around it, it's a very challenging environment to get your training done. On top of that, we have a collective bargaining agreement between the players union and the league, and there are certain limitations again with what we can and can't do in the off season. Now, more specifically with training and those physical limitations, our athletes are participants in a sport that's not a natural movement to the body. So skating is a very unnatural movement. It works in multi-planes. So we have frontal planes, we have sagittal planes, and it's really, really challenging on the hips. So not only that, it presents with hip problems, but we end up with a lot of low back issues as well. So just very cautious around how we load our players, particularly in season, and making sure that we aren't creating any soreness or loading the athlete that might have a negative consequence on a game. And like I said, games are happening every other day. So you've either just played one the day before or you're likely playing one tomorrow. Part of the interest I had in 1080 Motion, and when Ali and the group first came through Los Angeles to talk about some of their technology, was my background with ski racing. We were always really curious around the ability to eccentrically load athletes. And, you know, there's a number of ways that we've all played with and tried to enhance eccentric training, you know, from very rudimentary levels and with weight releasers and these types of devices to more advanced technology. There was a time where we had some other rudimentary, primitive sort of robotic resistance coming out of Europe that just was very, very cumbersome. So eccentric training was sort of the first curiosity of mine, and that's how we got 1080 Motion in the door at first. But as we started to play with it, obviously there was so much more to it than just the eccentric component. Now, to get the equipment purchased and in the door, we had to have a little bit of an aha moment. And the first thing we actually brought in was the 1080 Sprint. And at the time, we were able to run a sprint profile. We had some athletes on the ice, and we would test them. And we had an experience with a particular athlete who we had drafted, who had a very inefficient skating stride, we'll call it. And the data that we got out of his single trial really, really highlighted where this sort of mechanical deficiency was originating. And when we presented this information back to our general manager, there was obviously some excitement around it, and there was something very novel and new, and it would appear to be a competitive advantage with some of the testing we were doing. And our GM said, well, that's great, let's continue to do more of this type of evaluation. And I sort of coyly let him know that we had only rented the machine, and it was unfortunate that we were gonna have to return the Sprint unit. And which he promptly replied, no, you're keeping that, you're buying it. So we're certainly fortunate here in Los Angeles. We're a team with a lot of resources that's willing to invest in their players and do what it takes to improve both the training and evaluation. So that was kind of the story of how the first piece got into our training center. And now we run 2 complete quantum synchros, so 2 of those similar units you see in the image, and then the Sprint unit as well, and we'll get into how we apply those. So here's an image here, which I think kind of encapsulates you know, our training center and some of the, you know, it's a busy day for 1080 use. In this picture, it just happened to be a video on my phone, and what you can see there are the 4 units that we run. So we've got in essence 4 single quantums, okay, which work in tandem in the synchro. So we have the, you know, the Smith attachment included there. This athlete in the forefront who's working off of the prototype squat deck that we worked with Peter and his staff to develop. And you'll see some of the earlier versions of how we actually came up with this idea. But you know, there's a version of how we apply the technology here in front of us. In the background there, you can see the Sprint unit. It's opened up and sitting on the floor, and actually we have athletes working off the front of that onto our turf as well. So just you know, it's a real critical you know, piece of our puzzle, and that's how I want to phrase it. I talk about 1080 and their technology a lot, and it comes up constantly in conversations with colleagues. It doesn't replace traditional training. We have obviously like most of you, a very comprehensive program, and there's traditional loading, and there's a place for various types of intensity and loading parameters. 1080 is a piece of this puzzle. It's a really important piece, and it's a piece that we normally haven't had access to, but I want to reiterate, it's a piece, not the whole piece. So how do we apply the technology? There's 5 critical areas that we apply the 1080 technology, and none of these are mutually exclusive. They're all interrelated in some way, and it's actually kind of difficult to separate them. But what we'll talk about is how we test or evaluate the athletes, how we train, how we monitor, how we apply it in rehab, and of course, research and development. So one of the things I like to talk about when we're showing the equipment or we're talking about the equipment is the laws of physics when you're working with 1080 seem to change. So we know one of Newton's laws is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But when you're working with 1080 equipment, sometimes for every action, there's an increased and opposite reaction, i.e. accentuated eccentric loading. Or occasionally you have, for every action, there is a reduced opposite reaction. And that's when we're looking at concentric only loads. So it gives you this, it gives you an incredible set of tools to work with and to manipulate how you want to load athletes. And just with a few of these parameters, the applications become kind of almost infinite. I think one of the things we learned early too was we were really just limited by our imagination. So to have these sort of multiplanar pulleys that have multiple inputs with how we're going to manipulate, whether it's the external load or the velocities, it really became a wide open field of how to get creative with the tools. So with respect to performance testing on the Quantum, probably the biggest thing we look at is we're working with a frontal plane unilateral exercise. We test it and we train it. And it's skating specific. So in the image at the top there, we see an athlete who's extended in a nice long elongated leg. That position is something we train often, okay? When I say often, we're going multiple times per week throughout the summer, throughout the in-season. So our off-season is summer, obviously, competitive season in the winter. We're constantly coming after that action. Another key metric for us with respect to strength is pulling. So the pulleys on the 1080 Quantum are an awesome tool for pulling actions and rotational actions, but particularly in the max strength side, we look at horizontal pulling. When we get into the power side of things, like I mentioned, rotation, so getting very ballistic, whether you want to load just in the concentric direction or have some sort of rebound load that you'll have to absorb. But we have a handful of exercises we love to do rotational exercises with, both sort of on an angle and also just on a straight horizontal plane. And another one that we've really become fans of, especially now that we have the squat deck that is bolted into the floor, is vertical jumping. And we can load the athlete's hips at any particular percentage of body weight and have them do concentric only loaded jumping with no weight on the landing. And that's important for us. I recognize that absorbing forces is another important neuromuscular quality, but in our particular case, we want to reduce that limiting force. When we get to the sprint device, there's kind of two ways we'll use it, but with respect to performance testing, this has been an unbelievable tool for us for on-ice evaluations. And what we do is we just simply have the athletes sprint in a straight line, okay? And it's a really sort of basic test, but it's given us phenomenal insight into their acceleration abilities, the types of force and power they produce in a straight line. And not only that, the granular detail in the data that we're analyzing offline has given us amazing insights into different stride techniques, stride analysis, and stride characteristics. So if I just draw your attention to the bottom image there, this is something we do offline. So it's easy to take the data out of the software, out of the cloud, export it, and work with raw data. And one of my staff members has done some phenomenal work with breaking this down for us. But there's an example there of how we can look at individual stride characteristics and comparing athlete to athlete or athlete to the same athlete over time, but just a very powerful tool with a very simple test in a straight line sprint. And some of you might be thinking that sounds fairly straightforward, but keep in mind, hockey is not a very accessible sport. So, you know, we have to have access to ice, we have to have access to an arena, and the equipment isn't exactly quick and easy to put on. So it's a real hassle for players to have to go on the ice. So my point here is that getting access to this information with the use of the 1080 Sprint is really groundbreaking for us. So the next point here is that one of our underlying philosophies through this whole process is that the test is the exercise and the exercise is the test. And you've heard different versions of this statement, but it's really important to remember that we don't want to have a particular test that is, ecologically invalid. We want something that resembles what we're trying to get better at, and that if they get better at the test, they should get better at the exercise. And the exercise could be something like a skating stride. It could be something pulling or rotational, but they're sort of one and the same. Again, I'll say it again, they're not mutually exclusive. So when we get into performance training, so we've gone from the evaluation to the training standpoint, it's the same two pieces of equipment, but how are we applying them now in a more serial manner, day to day, week to week, month to month? Probably the biggest game changer for us in the training standpoint is the quantum and isokinetics, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But our ability now to microdose max force training in what traditionally has been a very difficult thing to train for hockey players has been absolutely game changing. I'll say that again. We're able to give them extreme high doses of high force training in small amounts more frequently using the 1080 quantum. And that's coming from isokinetics. I had no idea what we were going to do with isokinetics when we first got involved. That became probably our go-to parameter, is the isokinetic loading. Okay, so we're looking at max force and obviously max power loading parameter. The sprint's a little bit more challenging, like I alluded to in the previous slide. Getting on the ice is a challenge. In-season coaches aren't willing to give up limited ice time. So we get access to players usually once or twice a year in the off season. It's been something we're working away at now for over 4 years. So we have a very good database on this type of a test. But the on ice resisted acceleration for us has been a very nice implementation in our speed program. Okay, again, more traditional in the field, in the court, on the grass, it's easy to do, but to get athletes on the ice in their skates and their equipment, that's a challenge. And this tool really gives us more bang for buck when we do get that opportunity. And of course, we do off-ice resisted accelerations. Okay, so they're not great running athletes, but we do work in the 10 to 15 meter range, and we can then very precisely prescribe resistance based on what literature suggests as being optimal. Not only that, the feedback's instant. So if we see a performance decrement in a key metric, perhaps peak power, then we can either reduce load or we can shut a session down. So really excellent stuff to be working with on the fly. So what you just saw there was two examples of videos. One was the isokinetic lateral squat. It's essentially an exercise we've kind of developed and massaged over time. And the video showed sort of the rudimentary early stages of how we set the exercise up. Now it's much more formalized with the squat deck that Peter and his group have helped us develop. The second exercise is our isokinetic half kneeling row. And they're two very important exercises in our evaluation, but we also use them in the daily training environment. Set at very low speeds, so there's virtually no external load in that setting. So what you're seeing there is an athlete pushing at their absolute max intensity with no real external load, just simply a speed limit. So in a lateral squat, we're at 0.3 meters per second. In a row, we're slightly faster at about 0.4. And what we're looking at is how much force they can produce. Okay, so we can easily glean max force values, and then we can also look at some RFD information. While it looks like they're moving slow, they're moving as hard as possible. Moving on to monitoring. we're all fairly familiar with the idea and the concepts. I think what's important here is that monitoring is going to encompass a lot of different things as you track your athletes and try to either red flag issues or help intervene when things are going sideways. And so whether it's a biological monitoring parameter, if it's a psycho-emotional parameter, or a neuromuscular parameter, and where the 1080 equipment fits in our daily training environment is this idea of ubiquity, so that the equipment is there, the players are around it all the time, and it doesn't have a sense of being something new or invasive. They're so comfortable with being around it that to engage with the equipment, to train on it, and then what it's doing is providing us that feedback that sort of plugs into the back end of our monitoring system. So we can clearly see from an objective value how much force or power, velocity an athlete produces, which is obviously very important. But at the same time, the coach's eye is watching for how the athlete is preparing to produce those forces. Okay, but what I mean by that is, what's their emotional status? To produce a max force, you have to be fully motivated, you have to be engaged, you have to be focused. When we see an athlete who comes in sort of off their guard or a little bit depressed or a little bit unengaged, there's something there for us right away. So while it's not a real clear objective measure, we have the subjectivity of that experience to apply to our monitoring program. So that's why I think this ubiquity of the equipment is so important. Of course, when we're getting good data, the competitiveness of that information. So you see in some of these images as we scroll through, the tablet is being projected onto a TV. Okay, so that when we want it, the information that the athlete is producing is being displayed in front of both the athlete himself and his teammates. That competitiveness really drives intensity. Okay, so in a good way, we know we're getting very good, clean, maximum effort data. I want to just come back to this very quickly. I'm going to point something out and I'll let the video roll again. So again, I'm coming back to this image of a busy day in our training center. This was last summer. We've got a few different athletes milling about. We've got all of the equipment turned on and being used in some form. And in the forefront here, we have an athlete doing a concentric only squat jump. So look for the slack in the line. So the athlete's doing a squat jump. He's going down, he's holding his position. I believe in this case, we're jumping with roughly half of their body weight on their hips. Watch as the athlete lands. You'll notice slack in those orange cables. So he's landing with very little to no load. Okay, we've got an athlete in the background who's recovering from some horizontal broad jumps. And the other thing I want to point out is, if you see the TVs in the background, the data from the jumps is being projected on the wall. You're going to see another athlete sort of take a walk by. He kind of cruises into the scene, he takes a look at the TV, and he gives a little bit of a whoa. This is part of that competitiveness. These athletes are going back and forth trying to produce high power outputs in a loaded jump. So this kind of encapsulates that sort of feel I was talking about. So I'll let it roll again. So just I think a really excellent video that's, just shot on my phone. It was nothing set up, but just an idea of how this sort of is being integrated into that daily training environment. Next point I want to talk about is rehab. I think this is something we're getting more into. I think it's been a comfort level with the athletic trainers and the PTs. Our strength staff's a lot more proficient on the equipment, and there is a learning curve. But we've started to apply it to our rehab settings a lot more. And if you notice in the background, it kind of got this generic image of someone doing their external and internal rotations with the rubber band. And for us, you know, this is the death of the rubber band, right? So we don't know what sort of resistance, you know, it's light, medium, heavy, extra heavy, or whatever they classify the band colors as. We're now working off the 1080 in the cable system, and we're working with incredibly well managed loads. Okay, and so what we're able to do now is isolate joint strength training. So shoulders are a very popular one in hockey, as are hips, and we're able to identify and isolate certain joint actions. And then what we're doing is we're using auto-regulated resistance. And so if you're not familiar with the term, essentially what we're doing is we're working with zero external load. So the actual load on the machine might be set at something like 1 kilo or 2 pounds, which is almost nothing. Usually the handle attachment weighs more than that. But in an isokinetic setting, the athlete is in charge of how much resistance they produce. So in a rehab setting now, you can see how this is valuable. So having someone produce an external rotation at the shoulder with a isokinetic load, pain-free, is an amazing way to stress the damaged tissue to the point that it can handle, and to also then have the feedback of how it's performing. Okay, so this type of loading now is really what we're shifting towards, especially with the shoulders. Another nice feature of this is not just the isokinetic loading, but as the athlete becomes more functional, we can move them into a more free range. We can add a little bit of speed to the movement, and we can also then microdose in some of the accentuated eccentric loading. So if an athlete can now handle a 5 kilo concentric, we might allow them to then handle 8 kilos on the return. So there's this, again, we talked about it earlier, but there's this really, really finite level of manipulating loads and velocities that is super beneficial to the athlete. Another really nice component of this is, again, that feedback mechanism. So an athlete who's injured, you know, and we know the psychology around injuries, is looking for victories. And to have this feedback in front of their face and to be able to see an injured muscle perform better and better over time is an incredibly motivating factor. So again, it's just something that as we shift towards the more objective and controlled environment, it's bearing better fruit on the rehab process. It also goes back and shows the athlete, hey, you started here and look at your progress over this time. We feel super confident about that injury being ready to return to play. So it's, again, it just feeds back into the confidence element of returning. Last point here is research and development. And like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. So as we're training, as we're evaluating, and as we're collecting information, it's all sort of feeding back into this idea of R&D. So we have a lot of questions. We got a curious group, and hockey, like I said, is a tough sport to analyze. You're on ice, you're on skates, you're in this strange environment that's very hard to quantify. And we've always had a lot of questions about what makes someone fast. Okay, and there's some really smart people out there right now doing really, really great research. This has kind of led us down a path that I think is really exciting, and it's stride analysis. And so I've got an example here that you can see in the image on the left of the screen, one of our athletes who's connected to the 1080 sprint, and he's just completing a trial. We usually measure out 30 meters. We're very concerned with the first 10 meters. And in fact, we've actually got it down to about 8 strides. So it's not in great detail to the right, but what you're looking at is a variety of parameters that we've broken out of that information over 8 strides. So you might be able to make out strides 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 strides gets the player past 10 meters, and in our opinion, the puck race or the race for open ice is over. So it's a very finite distance that we've kind of become obsessed with. And we feel like if we can impact 8 single strides, that we can improve a player's performance. And so this type of information that we've teased out of the raw data is super valuable now in both the training and the testing process. So again, just feeding back into the R&D, Then we can talk about how the player's skate might be set up. We're talking to the technical experts on skating. We're talking to the equipment guys about how the skate's set up. So there's a number of conversations that come out of this because we've taken from the field. Okay, so some sports out there seems totally normal. Like I'm telling you now, ice hockey is a challenge to get information from the rink. So huge information for us, and this is probably one of the more impactful areas where the 1080 technology has helped us in our R&D. So I wanted to wrap up this section with a few anecdotes. As you probably appreciate, coming from the professional world, we can't share a lot of information. So just a few stories of how we've really noticed some improvements or various value adds. So here's an example of a player, and I do note that this is a weaker athlete, so the opportunity to get stronger is much easier and much more profound. But I pulled the Isokinetic Row max strength values. This is a 21-year-old first-year professional player, so coming in fairly weak, but keep in mind he's playing every other day. So imagine a competition schedule that heavy. You might assume that getting a player stronger is going to be a challenge. Well, here's just an example of what happened over that short period of time. So we have 3 data points here. We have June, we have September, and we have October. September was training camp, October was now in the season. We're only talking 4 or 5 weeks here. Okay, so in the image, what you're seeing is an 8% increase in the strong arm and a 38% increase in single pulling arm strength in the weak arm. Okay, we also have single leg strength in our lateral squat. We had a 7% and a 21% increase between September and January. Okay, so the strong leg 7% stronger, the weak leg 21% stronger. Massive improvements. Again, younger athlete starting at a weak point, but huge improvements by being exposed to this type of loading. Of course, on our force plates, we look at vertical jump, and we do that more often. But what we saw was an athlete who'd struggled to gain power over the years, okay, not being in our program, being at a college setting, for better or worse, finally coming into the pro environment, and mind you, playing every other day, had a 14% increase in vertical jump average power. Okay, that's relative average power. So again, big numbers for us, and it just goes to show exposing them to these high forces more often, how profound it can be on some of their neuromuscular qualities. The last point there, this athlete didn't gain a bunch of muscle, so we can account for a neuromuscular adaptation prior over the tissue side of, okay, he actually lost 1.5 kg mass in that September to January period. Another little story here. So not to beat this up with too many bullet points, but when we first got the 1080 Synchro system and we started to use that isokinetic lateral squat, there's for sure a learning curve. So we would run this off of one single column. Okay, one column can accommodate about 2100 newtons. And there's a learning curve. So the first time you work with isokinetics, players don't quite understand it. Athletes, you know, they feel like they can manage their intensity a little bit. Of course, as they learn that pushing harder produces more force, they really sort of understand that sensation, and they get good at this. So there was a learning curve for sure. Early on, occasionally an athlete would trip the circuit breaker at 2100 newtons peak force. Okay, very occasionally. And over time, you know, remember we've been working with this for 4 years now. Over time, a few more athletes would start to max out the machine, you know, and then the guys at 1080 helped us sort of hack the system and come up with a third gear. So we were trying to figure out ways to accommodate for more force. And eventually we got into the setup that you'll see now, which is the Synchro setup with the squat deck and the floor. Okay, and I don't have video of that today, but that goes around. So we now have 2 columns working together to produce the resistance that our players need. And so now 4 years later, when we first started, we had a team standard of 2 times body weight. So a 200-pound athlete we wanted to see them produce a peak force of about 400 pounds. Okay, so we're just taking the peak force in newtons and converting back to pounds just for simplicity's sake with the athletes. And very quickly, guys started to pass that. And we moved the standard up to 2.25, which is a good number. You can imagine in a free weight having someone do a single leg movement with 2.25 times body weight. That'd be pretty heavy. Okay. So in the first couple of years, we had about 8 to 10 players meet that standard. Okay, not bad. So we have a training camp with roughly 30 athletes, and about a third of them would meet that number. Well, last year we had a massive breakthrough. Okay, and so what we had was 21 players go into the standard level, so 2.25 times body weight. We had 5 players produce triple body weight in max force. Okay, unbelievable strength that these guys produce with isokinetic training. So the point there in the last one, our strongest player at a body weight of 92 kilos or 203 pounds produced a single max force of 657 pounds, 298 kilos on a single leg. Okay? It's really impressive strength. Now, keep in mind that isokinetics are super slow, and I don't need to get into how we're pairing that. We all know that doing super slow training all the time is not optimal for power and speed production, but there's pairing with that in the training. But I just wanted to highlight the progression of how strong guys are getting by using isokinetics. And keep in mind, it's concentric only. There's zero tissue damage. There's zero soreness. And it's something that we can microdose multiple times per week throughout the entire year, in season and off season. Last little bit of evidence here. So when we go on the ice, we do our sprint and we pull the data off. We've done some interesting stuff with how we're breaking this down, and we're looking at the ability to accelerate. So the image on the left is one athlete, and he has 2 trials separated by almost exactly 1 year. Okay, this athlete was drafted, so he's a young athlete. He's now in his first year of pro hockey. This player was drafted almost exclusively because of his ability to skate. Okay, a gifted skater, technically and incredibly fast, incredibly powerful. Okay, so the first data point, and the line doesn't exactly do it justice, but what I want to draw your attention to is how we're breaking this down. So the first data point in June of 2018, it took him 6.35 meters to achieve 6 meters per second. Okay, so we've chosen 6 meters per second as a critical break point. 6.35 meters. A year later, he's dropped that down by half a meter. This is already a gifted skater who we can see improving his acceleration abilities in front of our eyes. Very, very, very objective. So exciting stuff here. The second panel to the right is a comparison of 2 athletes on the same day. We have one fast, one slow. Okay, so the orange line, which is the slope that rises quicker and achieves 6 meters per second faster, we can easily compare 2 athletes here against each other. So 2 trials on the ice, we put them head to head on this graph. And what we have is a nice comparison between an athlete who's very fast and an athlete who has to get much faster if he wants to be a professional hockey player. Okay, so again, just a little bit of insight of with respect to how we take the data and how we're starting to work with it offline. This, for your purposes, is something proprietary. It's not 1080 analysis. That's something we do offline in our own system. So moving on to newfound insights. I think the biggest thing I wanted to touch on was isokinetics. And I said earlier, we brought the technology in because of my curiosity with eccentric training. Isokinetics changed our world. Traditionally in ice hockey, getting the strength training done was a challenge. And what we would traditionally do was a team would play a game, and we play night games. So you would finish a game at 10:30 at night. And then you would take the team into the weight room and do your weight training, because now you had, for argument's sake, 40 to 48 hours to recover from the training session, not to mention the game. And it made sense. right? That was what you had to do at the time. But when we were exposed to the isokinetic loading, when we understood what we were dealing with the equipment and what we could do, it totally changed our training paradigm. What we were able to do now is allow athletes to finish a game, get recovered, get rehydrated, refueled, get home, get to sleep, and then dose them again between days. Okay, this is powerful stuff for us because it enhances recovery from the game, but is still allowing us to provide stimulus at a safe time point between two competitions. So isokinetics by far the biggest game changer for us. Auto regulation is another important point here. I recognize different training environments. So if you're in a clinical setting or a personal training setting, collegiate setting, the way your traffic flows is very different. So to give you some insight, in our weight room, guys will train as a group. So it's not a massive collegiate weight room. It's significantly smaller, obviously. Guys will come in. We have 20 to 25 players in the weight room, and we have 2 coaches. And so we don't have the ability to be changing weights and hand-holding every guy as they go through their workouts. What the auto-regulation ability of the 1080 does for us is setting a load, setting a speed, and letting it ride, so to speak. So if it's an isokinetic workout, every guy has the same velocity settings. Every guy decides how much force they're going to produce. Super, super safe for us. Okay, so that's been another huge part of implementing 1080 equipment. I think one of the things people look at is, you know, it does require some manipulation of a tablet, and you've got to work with this robotic resistance, and oh my God, how are the athletes going to handle this? The athletes don't touch the computer, they don't touch the machine. They grab what they're going to do and they perform the exercise. Okay, so it's a little bit of a mental and paradigm shift of how you're actually interacting with load. The other really important part, which is related to isokinetics, but in a way, it comes back to how we can manipulate the settings on this machine, is concentrics. So again, I was really interested in how we could apply eccentric training in the off season. Well, what we really became fans of was concentric only work while we're in the competitive season. Again, because we want to reduce tissue damage and soreness. And we're always, like I said, roughly 24 hours to a game. Concentric only work has been huge for us. And you're simply reducing eccentric velocity. Okay, so that as the weight returns to its resting point, it returns extremely slow. So you have no actual weight coming back on an athlete. Probably the best way we've applied this, the first one is loaded jumps. Okay, and so right now we're experimenting a lot with load velocity, not to mix that up. Load velocity profiles, having an athlete jump and land with no weight, super safe for us. We can't risk injury in the weight room. Okay, so super, super safe for us. And the other one that we really like are some explosive rotational patterns. So very, very explosive concentric rotation with nothing coming back on the athlete. Next one that's been really profound for us is biofeedback, and I have a positive and negative there. So I think when it's warranted, the biofeedback, or the ability to see some sort of performance outcome rep over rep, is hugely motivating. Of course, drives quality, drives competition, and just the overall emphasis of a particular working set is increased. Just really, really positive stuff. Of course, we've all been there. I think technology is very pervasive now. We have it everywhere. There's numbers in front of everybody. It can also be a distraction, and we recognize that. And there's times where having someone try harder isn't a good thing, i.e. perhaps in a rehab setting. So I think what we've learned is just that there's a time and place for the data to be in front of the athlete's eyes, and there's a time and place where it needs to be turned off. And we don't want to mix those two scenarios up. Again, eccentrics is where I started with, but what we've started to really like, and we're coming back to it, is the accentuated eccentric loading. We'll do some of this with the barbell. So in the Smith setting, we can use some of our pressing patterns or hinge patterns in the Smith, especially with rehab athletes. But there's an awesome ability to microdose the eccentric load. Okay, so I think they have an ability to go up to triple times what your concentric load is, but just a very nice tool to have, and it's something that we're expanding upon. And then the last point here is data processing. So I think the guys at 1080 do a really good job at listening to their customers. I know we've been probably a big pain in the ass from time to time with requests and problems, and we've punched holes in virtually everything that they have and tried to figure out how to mess it up. They do have a really nice online data processing interface. So, you know, whether it's any of the parameters you want to look at, and even have an embedded force velocity option. But I think what's most powerful is the ability to download information in a CSV file and do your own analysis. Particularly the sprint unit for us at 333 hertz, you have very granular data. And if you have the resources to appropriately analyze that, I think there's a lot of gold there to be had. And so just going beyond what's being presented on the tablet, there's endless possibilities if you want to get your hands on raw data. So getting close to the end here, I think it's been a fun journey. We've really learned a lot about the technology. We've learned a lot about our athletes. We've changed the way we train athletes. We've changed the way we program athletes. And it's not that everyone has access to this. You know, our players are spread all over the planet. Not everybody's in our facility, but it's given us deeper insights into certain qualities and certain performance metrics of our game that are unique to hockey. So we're curious guys, like I said, we're question driven. And I think that the area that we're probably most curious about moving forward, and we've had some excellent discussions with the expert in the field, is the force velocity profile. And what's cool about these two pieces of equipment is we have the capacity to work in both directions. So on the ice, we're clearly working in a horizontal direction, and we're looking at where the athletes are deficient, whether at the force end of the spectrum or the velocity end of the spectrum. And then looking at how the correlations with a vertical force velocity profile correlate to on ice. And we have the ability now with this equipment to very accurately characterize those qualities. And I think the last part here that we're moving more swiftly into is the multi-directional hip and shoulder strength protocols, and more from a functional standpoint. So, you know, your traditions and abductions and these types of planes, and same at the hip. We have the ability now to not only build the strength profile, look for asymmetries, but use that as baseline data if and when an athlete becomes injured, and then use that as our progressive tool to track back to return to play. So that's all I have. Appreciate you guys sitting with me this morning. If your questions don't get answered today, I encourage you just to reach out to me. Email is always an option, and then on Twitter, I check it often. I'm not super active, but 2 ways to reach out, and hopefully we can get to what you have this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I want to kick it off with, you mentioned athletes are not using this type of technology or this kind of resistance. Can you give us a feel or what feedback you get from the athletes when they've been on like a 1080 Quantum using that cable? Is it a smooth feeling? Is it rough? How do they adjust, and what feedback do you get?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. First and foremost, the resistance is unbelievably smooth. So there's no question that what they're feeling under the foot or on the hand is very smooth, very precise loading. And and there's never been an issue with that type of a setting. But I think the biggest thing is that isokinetics are so foreign that if you've never felt it before, at first it's confusing. And so, for example, if we put 5 kilos on the pulley and we have a 0.5 meter per second speed limit, you know, I show an athlete, hey, here's 5 kilos. Look, it's nice and light. But at the same time, in the next rep, I can pull as hard as possible. I hit the 0.5 meters per second speed limit, and now I'm not moving any faster, but I'm producing, you know, a few hundred pounds of force. It's a little bit confusing at first, which is totally normal and acceptable. There's just a learning curve, and once the athletes figure it out, which isn't very long, they really like it. Especially guys who like to express force, but it's smooth, and B, just a slight learning curve.
In regards to isokinetic loading, how are you determining the dosage or the speed limit that you're using for these movements? Is there a normative data? Are you is it by trial and error? What are you using?
Yeah, it's definitely not normative. So I think what we do first is we experiment. You know, we've played with a number of the key movements that we work with. There is a velocity that feels right for each one of those. And I think most people who have worked with it understand this, but a pulling pattern is going to happen a lot faster than, for example, the lower limb pressing, and it has a little bit to do with the displacement. But you know, and when you get into a rehab setting, you know, if it's for example people doing ankle rehab, it's going to have to be incredibly slow. So there's certain joints that can only achieve certain velocities in a certain displacement, and so that narrows your band down quite a bit to what you're actually choosing between, and then we're simply narrowing in on something that feels right for the athlete. So to be honest, nothing normative, but we've just spent enough time playing with the different settings that we've kind of narrowed in on what we think is really appropriate, and then we're looking at the numbers that are coming out of the equipment, and do they make sense to us.
So you talked a little bit about rehabilitation and the use of it. Do you change your normative? So typically, let's say on a lateral squat that you're testing isokinetics, you may have a normative speed that you're using. For a rehab standpoint, will you dose that individually and say maybe we'll do a little faster initially before we get to the team setting, working with your team?
The short answer is no. And so if the question is specifically around the lateral squat, and I'll just use that as the example here. If an athlete has progressed to the point, if they had a lower limb injury, for example, let's say they had a knee injury, and they've gone through some of the more traditional rehab stages, and now we're back to the point where they're actually getting back into some more exercise and gym-based training, and we're getting close to return, and we're going to use the lateral squat as an exercise and possibly as a test. We would dose them and apply the exact same loading, and I'll tell you why. Is moving faster is probably going to be riskier. We're going to produce higher speeds. We're going to produce higher power, but at the low speeds, and remember we have low external loads, so we're putting 10 kilos on the cable, which for my athletes is almost imperceptible. Okay, it's 20 pounds of resistance. So the isokinetic loading allows that injured athlete to decide how much force they're going to produce, right? So if they're not comfortable, well, first of all, you probably wouldn't have them in the exercise, but if they're comfortable, they're going to be able to push a little bit harder each rep safely to feel how much more they can produce, and push to a point where either they're totally comfortable or they might have a little bit of a pushback from the injury. But we wouldn't change anything because inherently it's completely safe. The loading parameter on our isokinetic squat I could do with my hands. It's that there's virtually nothing there. So I hope that answers the question, but the short answer is no, we wouldn't change anything.
Using this system and your other systems in your gym, specifically to different player positions, do you manipulate different settings or different tests, let's say from a goalie compared to a forward?
We don't. And it's not that you can't, or maybe that you even shouldn't, but we don't. There's some things that we would apply to a goalie that we don't necessarily apply to a skating positional player. But at the end of the day, and if it's a question coming from someone versed in hockey, a lot of the planes of motion are similar. So a goalie needs to push laterally in a frontal plane. Well, a skater also pushes laterally in a frontal plane, just for different reasons. There's rotational elements that are important for goalies that are also important for skaters, but for different objectives on the ice. So we don't change many things depending on goalie or skating player. Not to say that you couldn't, but we don't.
Very good. Well, just a few more questions here. We've gotten some good questions about using the 1080 sprint on the ice, and I know you haven't used it a ton because you don't get a lot of ice time. But when you do use it, and if you wanted to check a player for symmetry, right and left force, is that something you've been picking up asymmetries and working on?
Yeah, exactly. So of course, that asymmetry evaluation we do offline. That's something that we're doing when we pull the raw data and we run it through our script to break out stride characteristics and stride performance. So unfortunately, it's not something we see live. You can visually inspect it, but the reality is that we need to analyze that offline. But if we've picked up on an asymmetry and we've intervened with some sort of training program and then we've reevaluated, there's certainly an ability there to observe asymmetry or symmetry in the stride and see if your intervention's been effective or not.
In regards to decreasing injury, have you seen that trend downward implementing the single leg and the isokinetic strength protocols?
I mean, injury reduction is a huge myriad of variables, and symmetrical strength in general is going to be important in reducing injuries. Preparation is key. Obviously, a fitter athlete is more robust and resilient to soft tissue injuries. I'm not going to say that we have direct evidence that this is reducing injuries. What I will say is that I will knock on wood because I think there's a huge element of luck, but our team has been generally healthy when it comes to soft tissue injuries. One thing that we have a very good handle on, and I believe it's due to this type of a training program or application of isokinetics, is our symmetry in lower limb tissue mass. So left leg versus right leg and lean tissue mass. We have very good symmetry, where in some times in the past it's varied a lot. Excuse me. We have great symmetry, so that's a very good baseline thing to have. In vertical jumping, we have excellent symmetry. Again, probably a good thing to have. And when we look at left versus right limbs in the lateral squat, we have very good symmetry. And I think by applying a lot of unilateral work, these types of asymmetries have flushed themselves out to a degree. And I think anytime you've got something resembling symmetry, of course not perfect and nor is it required, but something resembling symmetry, we have an athlete who's probably in a better position to withstand the demands of their sport and therefore reduce risk.
Excellent. One other question specific to hockey, and you don't have to get very specific to the answer, but with time on ice for starters to bench guys, do you dose your training differently, or do you do minimal training time for one group compared to the other over an entire season?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a common question in hockey, and there's a fairly large spread between your high minute guys and your low minute guys. And I think in a traditional sense, you might apply different volumes of work to guys who play more than to guys who play less. In this particular instance, what our paradigm shift has been towards is this microdose concept. I didn't come up with it. I've stolen it from people smarter than me, but this is how we apply it. And so because it's such a small dose, and when I say small, I want to be clear. If we do the isokinetic lateral squat, we'll do 2 sets of 3 to 5 repetitions per leg. That's it. And we can do that multiple times per week with 0 residual fatigue and 0 muscle soreness. And so it's already, to me, a minimum effective dose, and there's not much less you can do. So my big minute guys are still doing that same loading. Now, there's other things that we might reduce training load on, but when it comes to this sort of max force training, everybody gets their medicine.
Those are really good answers and very helpful. Is there anything else you're thinking about as we go through these that you'd like to share with the group as we wrap this up?
Man, there's a million things, and I think anyone who's ever caught me somewhere and started asking me about it, they're convinced that I work for you guys. That's not the case. I'm just a huge fan of the equipment, of the technology. I feel very fortunate that I work in an organization that allowed me to bring in this tool. It's been incredibly valuable for us. I touched on it again through the conversation. Hockey's a very challenging sport to quantify performance characteristics in the field. Skating treadmills are shit. Running on grass is not skating on ice. It's a real challenge, and I think the tools, both in the weight room and on the ice, have really allowed us to bridge the gap between more traditional weight room movements to what they're actually trying to do. And that transfer is so critical to us. So, I just think, again, we're fortunate. I know it's not something that all people can afford and can bring in. But I think the principles hold true. I think there's some things there that you can apply to more traditional loading. I really, really am a fan of microdosing and high intensity work in short volume or small volumes. But it's exciting stuff, and I think it's just taking off. I think what you guys are doing, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, I want to bring Peter in here to kind of thank you for sure and make sure we get all our ducks in a row as we wrap this up today. But I really appreciate what you've been saying and telling us about your insight into the 1080 system.